Everyone. My name is Heather Reed. Thank you for joining me here today. I use she, her pronouns, and for those using accessibility technology, I'm a 61-year-old white female and I've got ash colored hair, red glasses, and I'm wearing a navy top, and I'm coming to you from my home office. As a reminder for every episode of Event Contracts Exposed, I am not a lawyer and nothing that I discuss here should be considered legal advice. This is all about education, insights, and practical strategies offered by a seasoned event professional. And before we begin, I'd like to note that all content in this presentation is copyrighted and is the intellectual property of Planner Protect Inc. It may not be copied, reproduced, distributed, recorded, or used in whole or in part without my explicit written consent. Thank you so much for respecting my work and original content. Essentially, an event contract will contain terms and conditions that impact the client financially from the moment of contract signing through to the payment of the final invoice. And because of this, the negotiated, and I mean that term, negotiated final event contract needs to define what the client will need to control at each stage of the event life cycle. Because of this, the final negotiated event contract needs to explicitly define what the client needs. For teaching purposes, and in this episode, and also in the Certified Event Contract Professional program, I've divided up the event life cycle into three phases: pre event phase, during the event phase, and post event phase. And these three phases are useful when we think about the contract clauses and terms that are needed to address the client's financial needs and expectations as it relates to the contract that has been provided by and negotiated with the supplier. So, first up are the contract considerations related to the pre event phase that need to be reflected in the event contract language. So, this I think of as the period of time from the contract signing up to the day before the event. Then we have during the event, and this is the second phase. This covers the actual operational dates of the event itself. So, whether it's a 1 day event or the first event day through to the last event day. And then thirdly, we have the post-event phase. This is the period after the event concludes when final invoices are issued, disputed charges are reviewed, and the final payment is ultimately processed. So I want to give you some notes here. So each of these life cycle phases needs to be reflected in the negotiated event contract so that the client is assured that all of its own financial terms, conditions, responsibilities, expectations, and requirements are included. When a client thinks through each of the three phases strategically with specific attention paid to financial terms, the client will quickly realize that most supplier contracts are insufficient in addressing all of the client's needs related to financial matters. And as such, it is the client's responsibility to negotiate first what has been included by the supplier, and second, and most importantly, to know what has not been included by the supplier, and then for the client to negotiate those terms into the contract. And I would also add here that rarely are financial terms and considerations usually found neatly packaged up or organized into one section of the contract. Instead, they are often scattered throughout a supplier's draft contract template, and as I've already said, may in fact be entirely missing. So, for example, deposits may appear in one section, and then you've got to go looking for the billing instructions. You might be talking about damages in another section and how to address billing disputes in another section. So, I want to share some insights for contracting considerations in the three phases. And I'm going to say some of the considerations. And I stress that word some. This 30-minute overview is not the be all and end all, but I am highlighting a few of them. So let's look at first the pre event phase. Again, this represents the contractual considerations that the client will want to consider for that period of time between contract signing and the day before their event. So, the core question for the client to consider when they think about their event and being reflected in that contract is how can the client structure financial terms that they can realistically meet and control? And I would add, and is everything that they need to know addressed? So this is really the section where the financial strategy of the event is established. So I show here 5 different considerations. So let's talk first about the first contract consideration, the deposit amounts. Does the client actually have the cash flow available to meet the proposed deposit schedule by the supplier? Or do those deposit amounts need to be negotiated to better fit with the client expectations or the client's ability to have cash flow? Are there internal approval processes that would slow down any payments by the client? Does the client typically process invoices within 30, 60, or 90 days? And do the supplier's proposed payment deadlines align with the client's expectations and realities? So a contract can look perfectly acceptable, but still actually really create financial strain if the payment structure is unrealistic for the client. And this is where we need to push back in an informed manner and really negotiate what is realistic and doable for the client. This is particularly important for associations, government organizations, academic institutions, not for profits, and then corporations with perhaps centralized accounting departments. So, really thinking through what are the deposit amounts and how are they being processed and handled. Deposits and payment schedules should specify actual calendar dates when deposits are due. Avoid vague wording such as 30 days prior or 90 days prior, whenever possible. The client should understand if invoices will actually be issued by the supplier in advance of the deposit due date. Will receipts be issued after each deposit payment? Does the client require invoices and receipts for every exchange of money? Will the client receive periodic written confirmation regarding the status and the application of deposit funds held within or by the supplier? So, where are those deposits being kept, and are they being kept fully to be applied to the client's event? Under what specific circumstances will the client's deposits be refundable or non refundable? Will the client's deposits be held in a separate account by the supplier, away from deposits of other group business or away from their day to day operating accounts? Can the client's deposits be held in an escrow account with the associated fees of having an escrow account shared between the supplier and the client? So there's all sorts of considerations just around the deposit. It's not about just the amount. The second contract consideration is rates and pricing. And I'll make the distinction here. Rates often refer to the cost of a single unit, such as a sleeping room rate, whereas pricing reflects the full financial picture, including taxes and service charges and fees and surcharges. So, the ability to negotiate rates and pricing is often dependent on the contracting lead time before the event dates. And it is one of the client's primary goals to contract and negotiate and lock in as many rates and pricing structures as possible. Ideally, the client wants fixed rates and pricing for items such as sleeping rooms, food and beverage, if at all possible, audiovisual services, if provided by the supplier itself, auxiliary services, and service and or administrative charges. Now, I know that negotiating rates and pricing into supplier contracts is a really big lift for clients. I know that some key financial terms, such as sleeping room rate or meeting room rental or food and beverage minimums, are often clearly identified by the supplier so as to protect their anticipated revenues from the client. However, what is equally important to the client, but most often missing from the supplier's draft contract, are all of the other sources of financial expectations. The industry calls these hidden fees, but I believe they're not hidden, but rather they're undisclosed by the supplier. And it is up to the client to meticulously advocate and negotiate for full disclosure of potential fees, surcharges, and commissions. And I'll put in a quick plug for next month's episode around undisclosed fees. So we have to really work hard to constantly be asking for full disclosure of any rate or pricing that is a financial factor for the client and get those in writing. The third consideration is around price change protection, or what might be considered the escalation clause. An escalation clause is contract language that allows the supplier to increase rates or pricing after the contract has already been signed. Now, for the client, a well structured escalation clause should clearly define what triggers an increase, which products or services may actually increase, what is the maximum allowable increase, and that may be a negotiated maximum allowable increase. How and when notice must be provided from the supplier to the client, and whether the client has the right to approve or reject the increases or be able to terminate the agreement. And there I see Joan's got a question. How uh, how far out can one expect to get confirmed pricing? So if you're doing an event in 6 months, you should pretty much be able to confirm all pricing and all rates. If you're doing an event 3 to 5 years out, there is a reasonable expectation to have escalation in pricing, but that's where we as clients need to be very clear what is an acceptable threshold of increase and when those increases will be put in place and when the client will be informed. All right, the fourth and the fifth contract considerations in the pre-event phase are clearly establishing billing structures for the client and for the attendee if applicable. So the client's billing structure may include considerations for a master account or what might be called direct billing. You want to be clear on what the credit application processes and expectations are. You want to clearly identify and inform the supplier of the approval of specifically itemized charges that are appropriate for the master account. You will want to identify who is authorized to charge to the master account and perhaps who is not authorized to make charges to the master account. And then what charges are not permissible to be applied to the master account. So lots of things around the establishing of what the client's billing will look like, how it's structured, what it's set up, and what it includes. And I think one thing that we often overlook is what about the attendees' responsibilities if we have individual expectations around the collection of revenue from individuals by the supplier. So if individuals, for example, are paying for their own sleeping room charges, well, we really have to be thorough in negotiating those terms as well. So the client will want to ensure that the contract clearly defines, for example, the sleeping room rates, the taxes, destination or resort fees, extra person charges, cancellation of reservation penalties, no show fees, incidental expenses. The contract will also want to specify the amount of deposit required for a reservation or when the deposit will be taken if not taken at the time of reservation, the amount of pre authorization required on site, and what forms of payment will be taken from the individual by the supplier. The client will also want to ensure that the contract specifically addresses when the supplier will refund an individual's deposits. So, if they've taken an actual deposit, but the reservation is canceled by the individual, what about cancellation of the contract by either the client or the supplier? What about deposits that have been taken, but the contract has been terminated due to force majeure? It is equally the client's responsibility to protect individuals' revenues into the supplier as it is to protect their own interests. So, the bottom line to remember about contracting for financial terms and responsibilities during this pre event phase is if it's not in the negotiated contract at the time of signing, the client doesn't actually fully control their financials over the event life cycle. All right. During the event phase, and we're looking at contract consideration. So this is the event day or the multiple days of the event. So the core question here during the event phase is the client wants to consider what can the client do in real time to prevent financial errors. So many planners assume that billing disputes are handled after the event, but some of the best financial protections actually happen while the event is still taking place. I know that planners and clients alike are stressed on site, and the reality of checking financials on site may be something that could be very easily overlooked or the responsibility of those tasks minimized. However, if capacity allows, it is worthwhile to contractually commit to reviewing billing and charges on a daily basis and while still on site and everything fresh in our memories. So the first contract consideration here is daily billing review. This could be contracting the client's expectation to review their master account charges collaboratively and daily with the supplier. This could be requiring the supplier to provide an in house guest ledger or folio report daily to the client. This could be contracting the right to review, to audit, and to dispute any charges while on site. And this could be addressing the supplier's failure to provide daily on site billing reporting. The second consideration, sleeping room block monitoring. The client could negotiate that the supplier provide a report on actual pickup against the contracted block. The report must show no shows, early departures, cancellations, dishonored reservations. The report shows the net inventory of the supplier on a daily basis and also verifying various sleeping room rates and sleeping room related charges. We might also think about banquet check reviews. So details that the client may wish to negotiate to be included in a daily F&B review might include reporting on attendance counts for each food and beverage function, reporting on product counts for items priced on consumption, verifying pricing plus taxes for food and beverage items, verifying service charges and gratuities, and ascertaining client signatures on a daily basis for such reporting. We may also have function space review that we can do on site. Details the client may wish to negotiate to be included could range from meeting space rental fees per meeting room, having those confirmed and itemized. Any additional charges approved by the client, such as power, internet, setup change requests. Um, so, as you can see in all of these contractual considerations, the bottom line to be protected here is that the client may not want to nor need to wait until after the event to prevent errors that could have been addressed during the event itself. And then our last life cycle phase is post event. What financial terms are required from the day after the event until the final payment is processed? So here, the core question is the client closing the event with a complete and accurate financial record? This phase focuses on master account review, final invoice management, dispute resolution around charges, and payment execution, just to mention a few. So let's look briefly at master account review. This is in addition to on-site daily verification. The client may wish to contractually request a draft version of the master account report, which provides the client with the opportunity to verify all charges, confirm that any on-site corrections have been made, and that all supporting documentation is complete and included before the supplier actually issues the final invoice. A second consideration for the actual management of the the final invoice, the client may want to clearly specify the client's expectations around the final invoice format. Do they require line by line itemization? Do they require just a summary of expenses? Or do they actually require both? When does the supplier provide the actual final invoice? Is there a window of time in which the client will receive the final invoice? Also, thinking about what payment terms has the client negotiated for those payment terms? Have they agreed to 30, 60, 90 days of receiving a final reconciled invoice? And also contracting what supporting documentation is expected by the client to be provided by the supplier, and not agreeing to pay the final invoice until all documentation is received. So while both clients and suppliers want to avoid dealing with disputed charges, in reality, there is often something to be disputed post event. So this is the third contract consideration. So even if the client had the opportunity to review charges on site, the client also needs to protect the right and the opportunity to address disputed charges on the final invoice. Ideally, the client should negotiate the right to withhold payment specifically for the disputed portion of the invoice until the matter is resolved. And at the same time, the client may be able to agree and negotiate that they will pay any non-disputed charges according to the agreed payment timelines. And then a fourth consideration here is the actual payment execution. So, what are the specifics of the final payment? When and how and to whom and what record keeping, all of those details around receiving, processing, and paying the final payment. So, an event contract contains financial obligations that impact the client from the moment the contract is signed all the way through to the final invoice payment. The negotiated contract must clearly define what the client needs to control to meet their own financial requirements and those required by the supplier. And so that means that the client needs to be really proactive and advocate for contract language that is thorough and strategic and addresses every phase of the event life cycle. So before folks leave for today, I have three reminders. One, if you want to learn what all of the other financial considerations are for contracts, consider joining me in the event, the newest event certification program, the Certified Event Contract Professional. You can check that out. You can also join me next month on July 15th for an episode called Fees Aren't Hidden, They're Undisclosed. And always remember that a well negotiated event contract isn't just a document, it's your power, it's your protection, and it's your peace of mind. Bye for now, folks.